History remembers her as a seductress, a temptress, a woman who used beauty to manipulate powerful men. History is wrong. Cleopatra VII was one of the most brilliant rulers the ancient world ever produced. She spoke 9 languages. She mastered mathematics, philosophy, and military strategy. She held Egypt together by sheer force of intellect when every force on earth was trying to tear it apart. She ruled the richest kingdom in the ancient world, a land of 3 million people, the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, home to the greatest library humanity had ever built. Alexandria was the intellectual capital of the world. And Cleopatra was its queen, the last of a dynasty that had ruled Egypt for 3 centuries, fighting to keep it free in the face of an empire that had already swallowed everything else. This is the story of a woman who became ruler at 18, who survived assassination plots by her own family, who forged alliances with the 2 most powerful men in the Roman world, and who fought to her last breath to save a civilization 2,000 years in the making. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, and the proof that the most dangerous weapon in the ancient world was not a sword, it was a mind. Cleopatra was born in 69 BC into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek royal family that had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries since Alexander the Great's generals carved up his empire. The Ptolemies had made Alexandria the most dazzling city on earth. The Great Library, the Pharos Lighthouse, the museum, where the greatest scholars of the age gathered to think. This was the world Cleopatra inherited. But beneath the splendor, Egypt was rotting. The Ptolemaic kings and queens had grown weak, addicted to luxury, paralyzed by court intrigue, surrendering power to Rome piece by piece. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, had literally paid Rome not to invade. He borrowed money from Roman bankers to fund tribute payments to Roman generals. He was called Auletes, the flute player, a mockery. Cleopatra watched all of this. She was learning what not to be. From childhood, Cleopatra studied with obsessive intensity. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler in 3 centuries to actually learn the Egyptian language. Her ancestors had ruled Egypt for 300 years without bothering to speak to its people. She learned Aramaic, Ethiopian, Hebrew, Arabic, Persian, Latin, Greek. 9 languages total. She was not studying to impress anyone. She was studying to survive. When Cleopatra's father died in 51 BC, she became ruler of Egypt at 18 years old. Under Ptolemaic tradition she was required to share the throne with her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII. He was a child. She was not. She immediately began ruling alone, issuing decrees in her name only, appearing on coins without her brother's image. The court around her brother noticed. They began plotting. Her brother's guardians, a eunuch named Pothinus and a general named Achilles, were the real power behind the child king. They resented Cleopatra's intelligence, her independence, her refusal to be a puppet. They whispered in Ptolemy's ear constantly. Egypt was also suffering, the Nile flood had failed 2 years in a row, crops were dying, the treasury was emptying. Discontent spread. Pothinus used it expertly. Around 48 BC, Cleopatra was driven out of Alexandria. Her brother's forces controlled the city. She was declared an enemy of Egypt, her name removed from official documents, her image defaced on monuments. A lesser person would have accepted defeat. Cleopatra went east, to the border region between Egypt and Sinai, and began building an army. She was not done. She was not even close to done. At precisely this moment, Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria. He was chasing his rival Pompey, whom he had just defeated in civil war. He arrived to find Pompey already dead, killed by Ptolemy's courtiers trying to curry Roman favor, and himself in the middle of an Egyptian succession crisis he had not anticipated. Caesar had conquered Gaul. He had crossed the Rubicon. He had never in his life encountered a situation quite like what was about to happen. Cleopatra needed to speak to Caesar. Her enemies controlled every approach to the palace. Any direct approach would mean capture and death. So she did something that would be remembered for 2,000 years. She had herself rolled inside a large carpet, or according to other accounts, a linen sack, and smuggled past her brother's guards directly into Caesar's private quarters. When she unrolled herself and stood before Julius Caesar, alone, unannounced, having just been smuggled past an entire military force, she did not apologize for the entrance. She did not explain herself nervously. She made her case. Clearly, brilliantly, in perfect Latin. Caesar, who had met kings, generals, senators, and emperors, had genuinely never encountered anyone like her. She was 18 years younger than him. She left him completely captivated. Caesar backed Cleopatra. He had the legal authority as Rome's representative to settle the Egyptian succession crisis however he chose, and he chose her. When Ptolemy's forces laid siege to the palace, Caesar and Cleopatra held out together for months, the Alexandrian War, until Roman reinforcements arrived. Cleopatra watched Caesar command. Caesar watched Cleopatra govern. Each was studying the other, and each was impressed by what they saw. After the war, Cleopatra took Caesar on a tour of Egypt by royal barge, a journey of several months up the Nile. It was brilliant politics. She was showing Rome's most powerful man the wealth of her kingdom, the loyalty of her people, the deep roots of her civilization. She was making the argument, without a single word of negotiation, that Egypt was worth protecting. Caesar, for the first time in his conquering life, chose not to conquer. Cleopatra bore Caesar a son, Caesarion, meaning Little Caesar. The child was both personal and political. He was a statement to Rome and to Egypt that the Ptolemaic dynasty had the blood of the most powerful man in the world. Cleopatra moved to Rome with her son, living in Caesar's villa, scandalizing Roman society, attending his triumphs. She was playing a long game. And then, on the Ides of March, 44 BC, her game board was overturned completely. Julius Caesar was assassinated on March 15, 44 BC. 23 stab wounds. The most powerful man in the Roman world, killed by the men he trusted most. For Rome, it was the beginning of a new civil war. For Cleopatra, it was catastrophe. Her protector was gone. Her son's father was gone. And the men who killed Caesar were now the most powerful figures in Rome. Cleopatra fled Rome immediately. She returned to Egypt, where she had her co-ruler brother quietly removed. She needed no more rivals. She began rebuilding Egypt's finances and military, preparing for whatever came next. She did not know yet who would emerge from Rome's civil war as the dominant power. She needed to be ready for whoever it was. Rome tore itself apart after Caesar's death. On one side, Mark Antony and Octavian, Caesar's allies. On the other, Brutus and Cassius, his killers. At the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, Antony and Octavian won. The assassins were destroyed. Now Rome's fate rested with two men who deeply distrusted each other, and both of whom would come seeking Cleopatra's support. Mark Antony summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus in 41 BC, intending to question her about her loyalties during the civil war. Cleopatra made him wait. And when she finally arrived, she arrived on her own terms. She sailed up the river Cydnus on her golden royal barge, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, silver oars dipping in perfect rhythm, incense perfuming the air. The entire population of Tarsus crowded the riverbanks to watch. Antony sat alone in the marketplace, his audience had gone to see her. Antony had summoned her to account for herself. Instead, she had turned his summons into her stage. She understood something that most rulers never grasped, that power is not just armies and gold. Power is theater. Power is how you make people feel when they look at you. She had made Antony feel, for the first time in his powerful life, like the lesser person in the room. He was fascinated. Their alliance was both personal and strategic. Cleopatra needed Roman military power to secure Egypt's eastern borders and to protect her son Caesarion's claim. Antony needed Egyptian gold to fund his campaigns in the east. Each had what the other needed. And unlike Caesar, who had always kept Cleopatra at a careful political distance, Antony went all in. He followed her to Alexandria. He stayed for years. He made himself, in the eyes of Rome, Egyptian. In 34 BC, Antony and Cleopatra staged a ceremony that would seal their fate. Called the Donations of Alexandria, they appeared before a massive crowd dressed as the Egyptian gods Osiris and Isis. Antony announced that Cleopatra and her children would rule over Egypt, Cyprus, Crete, and Syria. He was giving away Roman territory. In Rome, Octavian read his intelligence reports and began preparing for war. At its height, Cleopatra's Egypt was the wealthiest state in the ancient world. The Nile provided grain that fed the Mediterranean. The trade routes through Alexandria connected Rome to India, China, and sub-Saharan Africa. The treasury was full, the army rebuilt, the navy powerful. She had taken a kingdom on the edge of collapse and, through strategic alliance, brilliant administration, and relentless intelligence, turned it into something Rome genuinely feared. But Octavian was not Antony. Where Antony was emotional, generous, impulsive, Octavian was cold, patient, and utterly calculating. He spent years in Rome systematically destroying Antony's reputation, reading Antony's will publicly in the Senate to inflame Roman opinion, declaring war not on Antony, a Roman citizen, but on Cleopatra, the foreign queen. It was genius propaganda. And it worked. On September 2, 31 BC, the fleets met off the coast of Actium in western Greece. Octavian's Admiral Agrippa commanded Rome's navy. Antony and Cleopatra commanded their combined force. Everything, 2 decades of alliances, the fate of Egypt, the future of the ancient world, would be decided on the water in a single day. The battle went badly from the start. Antony's ships were larger but slower, his oarsmen depleted by disease. Agrippa's smaller, faster vessels outmaneuvered them with devastating effect. Then, at a crucial moment, historians have debated why for 2,000 years, Cleopatra's squadron broke off from the battle and sailed south toward Egypt. Antony abandoned his flagship and followed her. The retreat has been called betrayal, called cowardice, called madness. But Cleopatra was not a romantic. She was a ruler. She had the Egyptian treasury aboard her ships. She had her children. She understood that a dead queen saves no one. She was retreating to fight the next battle, on ground she could control. But the next battle never came. Antony's fleet surrendered. His army surrendered days later. It was over. Cleopatra returned to Alexandria knowing that Octavian would follow. She began sending him diplomatic messages immediately, trying to negotiate terms, not for herself, but for her children, for Egypt, for the continuation of the dynasty. She had not given up. She was regrouping. She locked herself in her mausoleum with Egypt's treasury, sending word that she would burn it all before she surrendered it to Rome. Antony fell apart. His fleet was gone, his army was gone, his allies were surrendering to Octavian one by one. He received false news that Cleopatra was already dead and fell on his sword. He died in her arms, carried to her mausoleum in his last hours. The great general who had once commanded half the Roman world ended like this, bleeding out in an Egyptian tomb while the woman he loved watched him go. Cleopatra met Octavian. She tried to read him the way she had read Caesar, the way she had read Antony. He was different. He was cold, controlled, and had already decided her fate. He needed her alive long enough to parade her through Rome in his triumph, the ultimate humiliation. She understood what he was planning. She began her own planning. On August 12, 30 BC, Cleopatra dressed herself in her full royal regalia. She performed her rites. She ate a last meal. According to the most enduring account, she allowed an asp, an Egyptian cobra, sacred to the sun god Ra, to bite her. Other accounts suggest she used a poison pin. The exact method has never been confirmed. What is confirmed is that she chose it herself, on her own terms, in her own time. The asp was not a random choice. The uraeus, the rearing cobra on the crown of every Egyptian pharaoh, was the symbol of royal power and divine protection. To die by the asp was to die as a pharaoh, under the protection of Ra, beyond the reach of Roman humiliation. Cleopatra was making a statement even in death. Rome would not define her ending. She would. She was 39 years old. She had ruled Egypt for 21 years. Her two attendants died with her, choosing the same fate rather than face Rome without their queen. When Octavian's men broke into the mausoleum and found her, she was dressed in her full royal regalia, arranged in a pose of complete dignity. She had given Rome nothing. Not her treasury, not her submission, not her tears. Octavian, who would become Augustus Caesar, the first Roman emperor, was furious at Cleopatra's death. He had been denied his triumph. He killed Caesar Ion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, eliminating any rival claim to Roman power. He allowed Cleopatra's children by Antony to live, raising them in Rome. Then he absorbed Egypt into the Roman Empire as his personal property. The conquest was total. Egypt under Rome became a breadbasket and a treasury, its culture preserved as spectacle rather than civilization. The Ptolemaic dynasty was finished. The line of pharaohs, stretching back over 3,000 years, was broken. The great library would eventually burn. Alexandria would eventually fade. 2,000 years of one of humanity's greatest civilizations had come to its end in the mausoleum of a 39-year-old woman who refused to kneel. The world Cleopatra died to protect did not survive her. But she had not died for nothing. She had shown that a woman alone, with intelligence as her only weapon, could hold the greatest empire on earth at bay for 21 years. She had kept Egypt free longer than any force of arms could have managed. She had fought, as she had ruled, with everything she had. Egypt asked for no better champion. The Romans who wrote about Cleopatra after her death had every reason to diminish her. She had humiliated them by refusing to become their trophy. She had made two of their greatest generals choose Egypt over Rome. She had built a kingdom that took Octavian himself to finally break. So they called her a seductress. They erased her languages, her military strategy, her economic genius. They left only the love stories. It was the greatest act of historical vandalism the ancient world produced. But the truth survived, in fragments. In the writings of Plutarch, who described her as speaking multiple languages and noted her intelligence as her true power. In the records of historians who wrote that men came to speak business with her and left having forgotten what they had intended to say. In the sheer fact that she held the Mediterranean world in balance for 2 decades through intellect alone. The legend Rome created to dismiss her could not quite contain the woman who had actually lived. Today, Cleopatra is remembered everywhere, in films, in books, in art, in the name of a city that still bears the mark of the dynasty she led. But the most important thing to remember is the simplest. She was not a romantic. She was a ruler. She studied 9 languages not to impress men but to negotiate with them directly. She allied with Caesar and Antony not out of weakness but because alliance was the only weapon available to a kingdom that could not fight Rome alone. Cleopatra VII. Last Pharaoh of Egypt. She spoke 9 languages, commanded armies, balanced the fate of the ancient world on her intelligence, and died on her own terms rather than Rome's. The empire that destroyed her is gone. The civilization she died protecting is gone. But her name? Her name has outlasted them both. The last pharaoh. And the greatest.